May 23rd, 2016, from TCT World News Headquarters in Chapel Hill. This is the Ready Report with Ethan Reddy.
Yeah. Ethan.
Thank you. We've got a great show for you tonight. Welcome to the show. Our main story for you tonight is about a topic near and dear to my heart: the birth and childhood of the religious right and how it has harassed and continues to harass modern politics. We've got a couple of interviews coming up, but now time for a quick recap of the history of religion in America. Religion has always been a central theme in American history, whether it's the settlers coming for religious freedom, or the Great Awakenings of early America, or how religion shaped our early government in the 1800s. We're going to focus tonight on the decades after the Industrial Revolution, when two groups of Christians arose: the modernists and the fundamentalists. The modernists had a non-literal interpretation of the Bible. They accepted science, like evolution, and they focused on morality and the social gospel, which was service to humanity and following in the footsteps of Jesus, rather than adhering to the Old Testament word for word. The fundamentalists, on the other hand, had a very literal interpretation of the Bible. They rejected science, like evolution, and they focused on personal salvation and rigid adherence to the rules of the Old Testament. Between 1930 and 1970, the modernists were much more popular. The progressives focused on social change, and they rejected the moral rigidity of fundamentalism. The Warren Court, the Supreme Court of the era, was known for being very liberal and handed down liberal decisions that went against fundamentalist moral rigidity, like Brown v. Board in 1954. American liberalism, the prominent political philosophy of the time period, was centered around anti-extremism, and that anti-extremism included religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalists were heavily involved in the KKK and the Red Scare, which created a negative image of evangelicals in American minds. This negative image was personified by events like the Scopes trial and Prohibition, which were just embarrassments for the evangelical community and made them look silly. The shift started in the South, land of the free, home of the brave, and also of evangelicals. During the majority of this time, the South supported the Democratic Party, but in the 1960s, the Democratic Party became more progressive. This caused the evangelicals to rebel against the South during and after the 1960s because of civil rights and cultural change that the Democrats supported. This rebellion was displayed in 1976 when Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, despite winning the South, lost the evangelical vote. By the 1970s, evangelicals had coalesced into a culture war against the social changes of the 1960s. These changes included Roe v. Wade, the 1972 Supreme Court case that legalized abortion, the FDA approval of the birth control pill, the Warren Court's removal of restrictions of what was considered obscene in media like television, and feminism and the fight for the ERA. In 1974, this culture war was personified by a debate over school textbooks in Kanawha County, West Virginia. In this debate, religious fundamentalists objected to evolution and sexual education being taught in the textbooks and felt that the textbooks should be replaced with books that more aptly reflected a religious and moral society. The liberals, on the other hand, thought that the textbooks were perfectly adequate and were suited to teaching values to the next generation of Americans. This conflict between evangelical and liberal America sparked a fervor for political religious morality, creating what we know now as the religious right and setting the stage for the election of Ronald Reagan and the decade of the 1980s. One of our guests tonight recently did an interview with a teacher here at East Chapel Hill who lived through the time period and can offer us some insight on what exactly happened and why it happened. I ask you to welcome Lee Franklin.
Thank you. Thank you for your cheering.
Welcome to the show, Mr. Franklin. I understand that you recently did an interview with an anonymous teacher here at East Chapel Hill.
Anonymous veteran teacher.
Excuse me, an anonymous veteran teacher here at East Chapel Hill who would like us to not use the name because of the dangers of the World Wide World.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if you could offer some insight that you gained from your interview with him.
I can.
So my first question is, what was the historical context that caused Americans to feel this way and led to the rise of the religious right?
Well, Ethan, Americans were tired of the excesses of the 1960s. Hippies were getting it on and tripping out, while the federal government was engaging in violent conflicts overseas and taking on new and radical welfare programs, along with extensive corruption and scandals. The American people wanted to go back to the supposedly good times of the 1950s. They believed that the only way to do that was through values and common sense. That would be provided by the newly found religious right through their strict moral code and fundamentalist religion.
We have a clip from the interview.
You, to some extent, always had churches were integral in the civil rights movement because of social justice. You know, that was the kind of the image of Jesus. What would Jesus do? Right. And so on and so forth. So, I think in the end, how you interpret your religion is how you interpret your conservatism, and to some degree your liberalism too.
My next question is, what made the religious right so effective in spreading their ideology?
Well, Ethan, the American people were looking for an outlet to take out their anger on liberals. When Christians started going on TV and preaching, this is known as televangelism, many Americans who were upset embraced these new teachings. Televangelists also created churches all throughout the United States which took the place of local congregations and continued to spread on a massive scale their fundamentalist views. Most importantly, though, religious leaders began to form political organizations to directly influence politics. This was a major change from how things had been done in the past because most religious leaders and religious followers originally believed that politics and religion should not mix at all. Now, the Moral Majority organization, as I mentioned earlier, had a huge influence on getting Ronald Reagan elected in 1980. Now, because of this influence, many Americans began to question whether religious organizations and churches should have tax-exempt status, but ultimately, the religious right won the day.
I think revolutionized both the ability to create mass appeal and the ability to generate mass revenue for folks like Falwell. I mean, Liberty University is built through donations, a lot of which were, requested through mass TV audience.
My last question for you tonight is, what made the religious right in the Reagan era different from earlier conservatism?
Well, Ethan, the religious right's unification with the growing conservative movement created a new ideology known as neoconservatism. This was different from traditional conservatism in one major way. Traditional conservatism was grounded in the idea of small government. This was championed by Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, who ran for president in 1964, actually won some southern states, but it was mainly due to his appeal to racists, and he had no religious appeal whatsoever. But it did pave the way for future Republicans to win in the South. Now, on the other hand, there were deeply religious progressives like William Jennings Bryan and Jimmy Carter. Both were evangelical Christians, and both were economically liberal. Now, the neoconservatives abandoned their traditional conservative roots in exchange for the new religious rights belief that government had to promote Christianity in government. Now, the Reagan administration embraced this neoconservative ideology and promoted religion's role in government. And at the time, evangelicalism had spread to the Midwestern states, and in 1986, 31% of Americans identified as evangelical Christians.
Now, just one more clip from the interview with our anonymous veteran teacher.
So the 50s through the 80s, you had what we used to call golf, country club Republicans, golf club Republicans. Pretty secular, pretty strong separation of faith and state. They want to spend a lot of money, want a smaller government. Weren't terribly involved in a lot of social issues.
Toward the end of the 1980s, the religious right encountered obstacles in their dominance of the Republican Party. Several prominent televangelists had very embarrassing scandals. Jimmy Swaggart, who preached that morality was necessary in American life and that American culture had too much sex, was found with a prostitute in his hotel room in New Orleans. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker funneled donations from their congregation to themselves in order to cover up an affair that Jim had with his secretary. Pat Robertson, another prominent televangelist, tried to run for president in 1988, but failed to win the Republican nomination. These scandals undermined the credibility of the televangelists and the religious right, and Pat Robertson's failed presidential bid made the religious right seem like they had lost power in the Republican Party. And now, time for religious leaders saying ridiculous things.
The platform committee of the Republican Party is pretty well congruent with everything we as Christians believe and teach and practice.
Most women do not wish to be liberated from their essential natures as women.
On behalf of family values, we've taken on Hollywood and the media elite, and we will not back down.
Bill Clinton and Al Gore represent the most pro-lesbian and pro-gay ticket in history.
Falwell blasts Tinky Winky as a gay Teletubby.
I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
Well, I totally concur.
Modern evangelicals often focus on abortion as a central issue in their fight for morality. So we've sent our correspondent, Varun Prasad, to interview a protester outside of Planned Parenthood.
It's a person from the very beginning, okay? So what was your point? I mean...
So my question is just wondering if there's a place for religion in government and politics, or whether the two should...
Are you serious? Are you serious? Is that really a question? I pledge allegiance to the flag. Okay, under God, okay? Yeah. Under God. It's in our Constitution. God. Is there a place for it? I mean, our country was based on, the founding fathers and their belief in human rights, okay? Yeah. Low at Locke and some of the other ones in religious freedom. Is there a place for religion in the government?
My main question, going along with the Pledge of Allegiance, is that the Under God amendment to the Pledge of Allegiance was added in later on in the 20th century.
And it was defended by Ted Cruz in the Supreme Court, and it stays, and all children are allowed to say in school. Yeah. Okay, for a while it was taken out because somebody said the name God was offensive to him because of religious liberty and rights. This is bull hockey, okay? Okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We're asking.
So don't talk to me about government and God, okay?
No, I completely.
This country was founded on religious freedom. We're the ones who are supposed to be telling the government what to be doing, not vice versa. It's a grassroots up, okay, not top down.
And I think politicians shouldn't be ashamed about their beliefs and forming their views. Obviously, like a theocracy is not appropriate. I think that corrupts both the church and at the same time, because power gets involved and people are failing. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't think a politician or people in politics should be ashamed that their faith informs their views, their beliefs, and also how they live their life. how they reflect their voting as a result of that.
Do you know, maybe, depending upon who's elected, the fact that I'm allowed to be out here and pray, and so is John, the fact that you and I are allowed to be talking about religious freedom could be in jeopardy. Are you aware of that? Do you know that the Conscious Protection Act, where we're asking the government that healthcare people are allowed to do things that they're allowed, that they don't have to do things in hospitals that are against their religious beliefs, like the poor Clare nuns who are being mandated. They're nuns who have a retirement home that take care of the elderly, that they're being mandated to support Obamacare, which supports birth control. What does that have to do with their, it's against their faith, okay? But I'm saying, depending upon who we elect, we could end up in a socialized government. I won't even ask you who you're for. I won't even ask. I know this interview is about us.
Please welcome Varun Prasad to the show.
Thank you, Ethan. Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, are you feeling all right?
Ethan, I think at this point it's really just I'm allergic to all of this bull hockey. I don't know how people do it.
That is understandable. We just watched your interview with the Planned Parenthood protester, and I was just wondering, how did you feel going into this interview?
Well, I think, as was very evident in the video clip that we showed, there's a lot of hostility going on. There's a lot of passionate arguments, and it was amazing for the most part. But when you really get into the connection between religion and daily life in America, and especially religion in politics, you do get a very special group of people who feel very strongly about those issues, whether that be good or bad. It's just their opinion, and it's really interesting to see.
It sure is. Can you tell us what you learned during this interview?
So I think what was most eye-opening for me was really looking at how the religious right manages to manipulate a lot of the truth in order to push their own agenda. And that, we saw it in the video clip when the generous lady who I was interviewing mentioned something about the Pledge of Allegiance and the under God aspect of it that she claimed had been sort of integrated into it since the Founding Fathers added the Pledge of Allegiance. And the reality is that was added in the 1950s as an American response to this sort of godless communism that we considered the enemy. And there was just this very strong push to use religious rhetoric, especially in the 1950s and going on to the 1980s during the Cold War, to use religious rhetoric as a means by which to combat communism and to promote American ideals, which freedom is the strongest. And we saw that later on when again, that lady that I was interviewing mentioned the fact that socialism was going to sort of take away a lot of the freedoms that we see as Americans. The idea that we're going to be losing our freedoms is one of the worst things that can happen, because freedoms are one of the greatest facets of American idealism, and so to lose that is a loss of essentially our identity. And so we see the use of God in American politics as a means by which to promote this agenda of the religious right and of conservatives in America. So, and I'd also like to continue in clarifying some of the things that she said about Planned Parenthood, because
that'd be very helpful.
I would really appreciate the opportunity to get the chance to voice my opinion, because I know that it was said that Planned Parenthood is in the business of doing abortions, and that's sort of the majority of what they do. And this is a thing that Republicans, especially during this modern debate on abortion, this is something that Republicans have been saying time and time again, that 94% of what Planned Parenthood does are abortions. But the truth is that 3% of the 10.6 million services that Planned Parenthood provides are abortions. Only 3%.
Wow.
This is in addition to 4.5 million tests for STDs, 3.6 million contraceptive services, 935,000 cancer screenings, and 1.1 million pregnancy tests and prenatal scans. And so it's really hard to see how conservatives now, and how the Republican Party especially, how they are able to sort of get away with using this religious rhetoric and sort of latching on to this one last facet of the religious right in order to promote their ideals. And I think that was the most eye-opening experience for me, because it's really interesting to get a look at the other side of the argument.
That certainly was very intriguing. After your conversation with this woman, where do you think she falls on the modern political spectrum?
So, looking at her stances on socialism, her stances on the the sort of integration of religion into government and the very, very, very strong role that religion plays in government, and also her strong defense of Ted Cruz and his arguments for under God clause in the Pledge of Allegiance, I would say she's probably a Republican. And that's, again, not good or bad. This is just her political opinion, and I think that's where she falls in the spectrum.
I think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, I think, judging from what we've learned so far on this program tonight and what we learned from her, she definitely seems to embody some of the principles of the religious right, where she links socialism to atheism and things like that. So thank you for joining us and sharing your insight.
Thank you. It's great being here.
After reviewing the history and some of the modern applications of evangelicalism, we're going to talk about the legacy of the religious right. The religious right has been mostly losing for the last 20 years, and they are growing more and more frustrated with the leaders of the Republican Party. Republicans haven't accomplished much in terms of religious or moral change on the national level, and have certainly fallen well short of the vast promises that they made to their constituents. Now, when facing a choice between an evangelical politician who has been a senator and an angry person who seems to stick to their guns and never back down, they seem to choose the tough talker. This has been exemplified in the 2016 Republican primary, where the voters and the evangelicals chose Donald Trump, someone who isn't very religious but is a tough talker, over Ted Cruz, a traditional evangelical politician. Offensive comments by both the Donald Trump and the Ted Cruz side have caused them to alienate many Americans, and recently they have been seen in a generally bad light, which is similar to the 1950s when they were connected to the Red Scare and the KKK. The religious right does still have strength in state and local level politics in states with lots of evangelicals, mostly the South, and have been able to successfully undermine abortion by closing clinics. The majority of Americans today, though, project the fundamentalist views of the religious right, and religion itself is on the decline in the U.S., with about 22.8% of Americans being unaffiliated, and many young evangelicals focusing on conservationism and the earth rather than morals and defending traditional values of American society. In conclusion, the religious right developed passion and elected leaders, but ultimately did not accomplish much meaningful policy change. That's our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. We're off for the rest of the time. And now, your moment of Zen.
What's that one thing at Thanksgiving you just have to have?
It's mac and cheese.
Sister, that is my dish. That is the one thing that I can rock.
But only once a year.
Good interview, Christy. Congratulations. What is this mac and cheese? Is that a black thing?
It is a black thing, Pat. It is a black. Listen.